Great. People are still coming in. That's awesome, given the time of the day and the length of the conference. Yeah, very welcome to this last session of today. As I already indicated, we have one presenter less in this session, so a bit more time for Q&A if you're interested in. And Yannick will start with his presentation. Maybe you can start sharing the screen.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect, that works well.
I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yeah, that's perfect. So you have about 15 minutes. If it takes a few minutes more, it's also fine.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Yannick Dam. I'm a doctoral student at the Institute for Food and Resource Economics at the University of Bonn. And today I'm going to present you our research on incentivizing commodity traders for sustainable production in the Brazilian Amazon. And this research was done together with Elias Cisneros from the University of Göttingen and Professor Jan Börner from the University of Bonn. Now, looking at deforestation rates in the Amazon, they were very high in the late 90s and early 2000s, mostly driven by agricultural expansion, namely soy and cattle expansion. And therefore, federal state authorities launched a plan to combat deforestation in the Amazon in 2004. And this plan contained various policies, which overall contributed to a reduction in deforestation from more than 38,000 square kilometers in 2003 to less than 5,000 square kilometers in 2010. And one of these measures I'm going to talk about more in depth today or in this presentation was the publication of a so-called list of priority municipalities initiated in 2008, which is a publicly disclosed blacklist of municipalities with the highest deforestation rates in the Brazilian Amazon. Now let's look at the deforestation statistics in more detail. You can see the peak of deforestation in the year 2003, and since then a steadily decrease in deforestation, hitting a low in 2010, as mentioned, and since then it has been more or less increasing again. The pasture expansion is highlighted by the blue line. Shows a very intimate connection with deforestation, and even the absolute size of the rates is very similar. What's interesting about pasture expansion is that it actually becomes negative at one point in time. So the overall area of pastures in the Amazon was decreasing during this period. But overall, it's a very similar development to deforestation. Soy is highlighted by the orange line. What's interesting to note about soy, so Brazil is the largest producer in the world together with the US, and soy is in many years Brazil's main export product, depending on harvest and the global price. But soy, the path of soy expansion and pasture expansion actually develops quite in parallel fashion until 2008, and since 2008 you can see that pasture has been increasing again, pasture expansion, let's say. And while deforestation and since 2008, soy expansion has been increasing again, while deforestation and pasture expansion were still on the decreasing period. So there's a sort of a divergence in the path between these two groups. This map shows you the location of the blacklisted municipalities. So most of them are located in the so-called arc of deforestation, which is basically right at the frontier of the natural vegetation of the Amazon rainforest. And you can see most of them are basically located exactly in this area. So many authors showed that the blacklist actually reduced deforestation, arguably driven by the intensified monitoring and stricter law enforcement that were enacted in these municipalities. However, it's interesting to note, or basically the question, why did the Ministry of Environment made this list publicly available? So we think that the public disclosure of this list could encourage additional stakeholder actions to mitigate the negative effects and consequences of the intensified public scrutiny that come with being on such a blacklist. So when you think about it, this process of naming and shaming has been used before to some extent, mostly by media and civil society. For example, Greenpeace published a report, Eating Up the Amazon, in 2006, in which they explicitly named soy traders dealing with deforestation and contaminated soy from the Brazilian Amazon, and which led then to these soy traders to commit to a zero deforestation agreement when dealing with soy from the Amazon. And it's also acknowledged that the public pressure has led to traders to develop voluntary sustainability standards. This leads us to our research question. So basically the question was whether producers and exporters of commodities react to the reputational risks that come from domestic forest conservation policies. And explicitly in this case, does the blacklist have an effect on soy production becoming more sustainable, meaning that deforestation for soy stops? And second, do traders circumvent the repercussion scrutiny by sourcing soy from different sources? So basically, do they leave soy from blacklisted municipalities aside and buy more soy from other municipalities? And lastly, whether the destination countries of soy from blacklisted municipalities change. Specifically, we look at exports to the European Union and China, which are the largest destination regions. And the EU as an example for consumers with higher awareness for deforestation in the Amazon, and China with an assumed lower awareness with regards to deforestation. So we use supply chain data from Trace, which offers data on soy exports, including the production, origin of soy, the quantity exported, as well as the importer and exporter firm, and the destination country. So the time span of this data is from 2004 to 2018, and we aggregate the data at the municipality level, which is the level at which the policy is enacted. To this, we add remotely sensed land cover data from Mapiomas, which is basically land use data from which we calculate forest loss, and agricultural expansion data, which you saw before. And we add several control variables like GDP per capita, soy suitability, and commodity transport costs from various other sources. So here, this figure shows you soy exports by destination. On the left-hand side, you see soy exports from the entire Amazon region. And on the right-hand side, explicitly only exports from blacklisted municipalities. And please be aware of the different scale on the y-axis. I think what's interesting to note about this figure is that in the first year in 2004, if you look on the left-hand side, the largest share of exports was going to the European Union. But the absolute size of soy exported to the EU stays at a rather constant level. In contrast, if you look at exports to China, they start from virtually no exports at all to China, to the extent that in 2018 there was more soy exported to China than the entire rest of the world, excluding domestic consumption in this case. Looking at soy exports from blacklisted municipalities, the overall story is very similar. Basically, just the numbers are different. So we want to estimate the causal effect of blacklist on various soil-related outcomes. However, there are a few challenges that we need to overcome. First of all, not all municipalities were added at the same time to the blacklist. So it's a staggered treatment introduction. We have 35 municipalities added in 2008, and this number goes up to 60 before 2018. And the other problem is how to find good counterfactuals for municipalities that are explicitly top deforesters. A possible solution would be to use matching to find control municipalities that have parallel trends with regards to deforestation, and then estimate the difference in differences model. However, this does not solve the problem of the staggered treatment introduction. And the other problem is that we want to estimate the effect on various outcomes, not only deforestation, and it's difficult to ensure parallel trends for all these outcomes with one large data set. So instead, we try a new method called the generalized synthetic control, which, as the name says, generalize the synthetic control method by imputing counterfactuals for each treated unit using the pre-treatment outcome path as a benchmark, and this easily allows for a staggered treatment introduction as well as different outcomes. So first of all, we try to replicate the results, so the previous found results on deforestation. So we estimate an average treatment effect on the treated of 143% deforestation reduction in blacklisted municipalities, which translates to around 116 square kilometers less deforestation per municipality and per year. And comparing these results to previous results, so most authors analyzed the period from 2008 to 2011 and found overall total avoided deforestation between 4,000 and 11,500 square kilometers in this period. And our estimates would suggest a deforestation reduction of 13,000 square kilometers. So it's at the higher end and even the highest estimate so far. However, we know of the blacklist. And if you look at this graph, you see that the strongest effect size actually occur 3 to 7 years after treatment, so they would be missing the strongest effect size. We then look at the blacklist effect on pasture and soil expansion. And first of all, I think you can note that the path of avoided pasture expansion follows the path of avoided deforestation very closely. And even the absolute effect size is very similar. So it was 116 square kilometers for deforestation, and it's 122 square kilometers for avoided pasture expansion. So it's very close. And on the other hand, we do not see a decrease in soil expansion at all, but rather a significant increase in soil expansion, which is very interesting. The average treatment effect is 62.2% or 11 square kilometers, close to 11 square kilometers per municipality and per year. The nice thing about the Mapiomus land use data is that we can actually look at which type or how a specific land was used in the year before it was replaced by soil. So we look at basically on what kind of land use soil expanded on, and the largest expansion was on prior pastures. So around 4 square kilometers of soil expanded on prior pasture areas, and the second largest was on other cropland. So here soil is replacing mostly previously cleared lands in the form of pastures and other crops. However, we also find significant effects on soil expanding or still expanding on forest land, and also on all other forms of land use. Effect sizes are very small. If you look at, for example, on forest, it's only 0.3 square kilometers. However, I think it's quite a surprising result. So we did not expect any soil expansion on forest anymore. However, the effect size is so small that this could still be a legal amount of deforestation occurring in these municipalities. Next, we look at export destinations, so total export by different destinations, mainly European Union and China, and we do not find any significant results, as you can see from the top two figures. So there doesn't seem to be any shifting of soy exports from going to the EU to China. Instead, when we look at the share, it would suggest that there is a significant effect. So we find a slight increase in the share of exports going to China when compared to control municipalities. and also a negative effect of shares going to the EU, although insignificant. But overall, the total exports would suggest that there's no effect. We could also, or what we also wanted to do actually was to further analyze effects by traders and exporter firms. However, the problem is that the landscape of traders is even more scattered than the destination countries. And this leads basically to insignificant results all over the place. It's basically impossible to find significant effects there. So to summarize, we confirm previous results of decreased deforestation and find even slightly higher effect sizes, which is probably or most likely due to the drastically reduced pasture expansion given the very similar effect size. Soil expansion, on the other hand, became much more sustainable. It's now replacing almost exclusively previously cleared lands, and the amount of soil replacing forest land could suggest that it's still a legal amount of deforestation occurring and not illegal deforestation as previously. However, we do not find any convincing results of shifts basically by traders sourcing soil from different municipalities, as well as no significant results change in the destination countries, so to which soil is exported to. However, since soil expansion became so much more sustainable, it could be the case that these traders and important countries don't necessarily see a case for further action on their side. So thank you very much for your attention and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Yannick, for the nice presentation. So I will hand over to Karishma first for her comments on this paper. And in the meantime, please post your questions or comments in the chat. Yeah, and maybe Yannick, you can unshare your screens in case Karishma has slides to share. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Yannick, for that very interesting presentation. And I really enjoyed reading your paper as well. I think the theme is quite topical and very relevant for today. And I also like the interesting approach of focusing on a sort of low-cost policy instrument than the traditional approaches we see around trade barriers. So I think that's a novel element of the paper. So I really do appreciate that. I had a couple of general questions and I think one or two clarifications on the methods. So my first general question was around the fact that at the outset you say that you expect to see that with this sort of blacklisting of municipalities that there's going to be some sort of trade diversion from EU to China, and then later on you find that there is not much evidence of this occurring. So you don't actually find that sort of trade diversion there. So and then you also make the point that it's largely because these traders or the larger traders are very sticky in their behavior of sourcing patterns. And even if the traders are slow in shifting, you also have new traders which could potentially come in and take their places as well. So my question is then, do we actually see any sort of economic costs of this blacklisting happening? So for the producers, to me, it seemed more like a perceived cost of being blacklisted. But are there actually any economic costs of being blacklisted? Since we're not seeing that sort of trade diversion or effects on exports? So I'm just wondering how the story plays out there. And the second question was around just trying to connect it. And if using the data, is there possibility of unpacking the effects according to sort of direct deforestation and impacts on indirect deforestation, because you do mention that in the paper as well, and I thought that was interesting because we see sometimes that farmers are growing rice plantations as a way of preparing the soil, for instance, for soy production in the future, or you might have soybean production or expansion occurring at the cost of other crops. So can we actually distinguish that? And also linked to that is that if soybean production is occurring at the expense of other crops, any thoughts that you have to share on sort of what that means for export diversification? So we see that blacklisting has an impact on deforestation, but what about the sort of product mix and export diversification of these producers? So I would be a bit interested in knowing that and linking that to what's happening in the current debates. And the specific comment on the methodology, so one was around, just understanding a bit more why DID, the difference in difference approach is not applicable, because I think you do have advances in that as well in terms of time varying DID now, right? When the treatment varies over time and you have, papers coming out on that as well. So I'm just wondering if that's something that you've thought of. And second was and interestingly, do you see any sort of switch happening in this blacklist? I know that your time period is not that much, but do you actually see any municipality being dropped from the blacklist if, for instance, the municipality has made efforts into reforestation or has reduced the deforestation to a certain threshold? Because that would be interesting to see if there is a sort of switching going on as well between municipalities, particularly if you treat that as your treatment group. I think that's a big problem with the sort of literature as well. So yeah, I think overall this was a very interesting paper and I quite enjoyed reading it, and I think make a lot of interesting points there. So just interested in hearing your thoughts on this, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Karishma, for your comments. Yannick, do you want to respond directly to?
Sure.
Please.
I think there were quite a few points there. So yeah, I think it would be nice to address them. So first of all, you mentioned, I think, the costs, economic costs of the blacklist policy. So first of all, what I mentioned is that being on this blacklist is associated with intensified monitoring and stricter law enforcement from regulatory agencies. And most of deforestation occurring in these municipalities and overall in the Amazon was illegal, but it was not being addressed before. And with these introduction of the blacklist, basically they set the focus mostly on these municipalities and started fining people for doing this illegal deforestation. So they had a real-time assessment of deforestation happening, or detection system, and then they could fine people who owned this land on which illegal deforestation occurred, according to fines that were already existing before, but just were not enacted or enforced before. And so this basically increased the costs of illegal deforestation in real terms on the ground by quite a bit. And this is probably why we see a reduction in deforestation. Now, this is also connected basically to your second question, which regards the direct and indirect drivers of deforestation in the Amazon. And I think there's quite a debate in the literature whether soy now replacing pastures is basically driving pastures deeper into the Amazon, because basically they also want to grow their cattle. And in this sense, we don't see any direct deforestation for soy, but soy is driving basically deforestation indirectly by replacing pastures. This is not really the topic of this paper, so I can't say too much about it in this case on what we found. But I think what we found is that, or what we read is that pastures are not only used basically as a form to grow cattle, but also as a form to get land titling rights on certain lands. So basically, cattle is raised there, and therefore this gives you the right to own this land, or with this form of on-the-ground establishment of pasture areas there, you have the ownership of this land. And therefore, pasture areas are not only there to raise cattle, but also as a form of land grabbing and land titling. And I think there's quite a good convincing case for soy still driving deforestation indirectly, since soy is basically a much more profitable form of land use, and people could be trying to grab basically lands with pastures that could be then in future converted to soy areas. Now the third and fourth questions, I have to remember them. I think your first question was regarding the matching and difference of difference. Yeah. And the third question?
Yeah.
Okay. So the problem with the matching or the difference of difference was that, first of all, with the matching, how do you determine the pre-treatment period when you have like a different introduction of treatment for all, at different times? So usually what we do in matching in the panel data set is that you determine the pre-treatment period, and then basically you match your units based on this pre-treatment unit period and the covariates observed there. However, the problem is that we could make a cutoff in 2008, but then you have like half of the sample of treated units getting treatment at a later point, and you will still be matching basically them at a point too early. And we think that's a much better, more convincing case to use the synthetic control, which basically does synthetic control is quite similar to the matching in the sense, since it basically builds a synthetic counterfactual as a weighted average of control units. So basically like matching weights or so, if you want, but does that for each individual treated unit. And so you have basically, you're independent of the staggered treatment introduction, and you also account for all different outcomes. So you don't have to find one specific match data set that accounts for all outcomes, but basically the synthetic control does so individually for each treated unit and the outcome.
Thank you. We have some questions in the chat. One question refers to your framing of the paper. So you started with basically saying that pressure from consumers or NGOs might be a reason for, not deforestating, if this is a correct word. So the question is basically if you link data on public campaigns, for instance, with your data. If there's maybe like a section in the paper you're not presented, or if you thought about it.
Sorry, where do you see this? Okay, I see. Yeah,
it's the last question in the chat. Yeah. So have you basically checked if there's public campaigns targeting specific municipalities?
So there, I mean, there has been quite a few campaigns, and I think deforestation in the Amazon is actually one of the regions in the world with most attention on with regards to deforestation and fires. If you look at media coverage, for example, in Germany or all over the world. So we didn't link it explicitly to public campaigns, but we know, for example, in the case of the Greenpeace report, I showed you that this was arguably the driver for the zero deforestation commitment by soil traders that were mentioned in this report. And the stakeholder action, basically, or if you want, the public scrutiny that comes from this blacklist. So it's basically there's a list made available publicly, and you have the name of the worst actors behaving badly, if you want. And it doesn't have to be specifically any campaigns, but that this draws attention from NGOs in the region and also the press, which is arguably more critical in democratic and free press countries. So, for example, like the EU, which is also why we assumed that soil exports to the EU could be more sensitive towards deforestation than compared to China.
Okay, great, thank you. So it's basically halftime, so I would hand over to Karishma now for her presentation. Thank you for your comments so far, and thank you for the presentation, Yannick.
Sure.
And if there's further comments, please just post them in the chat.
Hello, hi everyone. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Great. And can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Perfect. So hi everyone, I'm Karishma Banga. I work as a research fellow in the Digital and Technology cluster at the Institute of Development Studies, IDS. So I would just like to start off by thanking the organizers for also inviting me in today's session and for giving me the opportunity to present my work on global value chains, changing geographies and product sophistication in the case of Indian manufacturing. And this is pretty much still a draft, so I do welcome any feedback and suggestions in improving the paper. So just to give a quick start, product sophistication has been associated with economic development in several studies, including through shifting the technological frontier of a country and improving its growth performance. It's also been associated with increased stability of trade in global value chains and has fostered structural transformation. Empirically as well, there has been a positive link established between export sophistication and economic performance. And as a result, a strand of literature has emerged, which looks at the drivers of product sophistication at the macro and micro level. And within this sort of strand, there is a sub-strand which looks at global value chains or GVCs as a driver of product sophistication, or more broadly, product upgrading, which could mean product innovation, product changing of product mix, as well as sophistication. And numerous channels here have been identified in the studies. So some studies have found a learning by importing effect in value chains, where countries can learn by importing capital goods and learning from the technology and knowledge embedded in these goods. And empirical evidence of this has also been found for developing countries like India, Taiwan, and Chile. And secondly, there has been a learning by exporting effect, where countries are exporting to foreign markets and they're exposed to sort of foreign competition. And as a result, that has created incentives for them to innovate and to become better, which has then led to improvements in product innovation. Thirdly, there has been a strand looking at two-way trading and how simultaneously engaging in importing and exporting activities, which is what is closely related to GVC trade, is leading to certain cost complementarities that you end up saving more. And those cost savings are then invested into more sophisticated product lines or product innovation. And again, evidence of this has already been documented for the case of European firms as well as Turkish firms. And lastly, when we look at India in specific, we find that there's very limited evidence and mostly it looks at product innovation. So there have been a few studies which have found that importing intermediates in value chains and two-way trading has had a positive impact on product innovation, as well as the product mix. But largely the literature tends to focus on product innovation rather than sophistication of products, which is the main topic of this study. So I've divided the paper into two sections, where the first section looks at just mapping India's global value chains participation at the outset and trying to understand some macro level trends. So India in particular is an interesting case because even though it is so close in terms of geography to what is known as factory Asia, it has relatively low linkages into global networks and global value chains, particularly amongst the South Asian economies. And this is largely due to a very stagnant growth in the manufacturing sector, low ability to attract FDI or foreign direct investment into the sector, extremely low levels of R&D, as well as increasingly financial constraints that are prohibiting these firms from linking into value chains. And even when Indian GVC firms do link, they remain locked into low value added manufacturing, which capture low economic rents. And so this is what we already know from the literature, and these are established sort of facts. What my paper also looks at is that I find that India is increasingly mirroring what is known as this trend of polycentric trade pattern. So this was this concept by Horner and Nadvi that document a rising importance of southern partners or southern end markets for developing countries linked into value chains. And I find a very similar trend occurring in India as well. So if you look at, so this graph looks at the forward and backward linkages of India using partner shares. And so if you look at the red line here, which is the forward linkage of India to global north, and this green line is the backward linkages of India from the global north. And you can see that these two, the linkages from global north, have been on a steady decline in the period 2005 to 2015. And this shift is clearly absorbed by the global south partners. So the forward linkages of India into global south has increased from 15% to 23%. And the backward linkages from the global south have also witnessed a drastic increase from about 28% to almost 45%. So you can see that there's a clear shift in India's GVC trade. And largely, if you look at which countries the top 5 countries where this change is occurring, we find that mostly the linkages are moving away from United States, United Kingdom and Germany, and mostly absorbed by China. So if you look here, India's backward linkages from China, in fact, saw a 17 percentage point growth, a change between 2005 to 2015. Which is quite significant. And you also see some rise for the case of Indonesia, Thailand, Turkey, and Vietnam. And so I think this sort of GVC shift from northern markets to southern markets also is raising concerns now about India's export sophistication, particularly because if you look at the graph here, India's export sophistication to the global south has been so far less sophisticated. The export basket has been less sophisticated to the global south as compared to the global north, particularly here. Particularly you can see, so this black line has been consistently below the red line. So this is raising concerns about how these sort of shifting geographies is going to impact export sophistication. And then so in the second section of my paper, I bring down this macro level discussion to the firm level or to micro level. And I try to understand how GVC participation is impacting product sophistication for Indian firms. And this is largely using the prowess data set, which is the firm level data set for India. And I've constructed an unbalanced panel of Indian manufacturing firms in the period 2001 to 2005. And so this is the main research question that I'm trying to analyze. So the baseline, so this, I've just presented here the baseline econometric specification for that research question, where PS is the product sophistication of firm I, which is regressed on product sophistication in the previous period to capture persistency in product sophistication basket of a particular firm. Then you have GVC integration, which is the main variable. And this captures both GVC status, so whether or not a firm is a GVC firm, but also the actual magnitude of GVC participation. And then you have R&D intensity, so controlling for firms' own efforts to innovate. This is the Herfindahl index, which captures the industry concentration to which the firm belongs. And then X is a set of control variables, age of the firm, size of the firm, whether or not it's a multi-product firm, productivity, and so on. So it controls for a set of other variables. And then you have firm industry and time fixed effects that can impact product sophistication. And so the main problem that we face when we're looking at estimating this model is that of endogeneity arising from simultaneous shocks that can affect both GVC integration and product sophistication, as well as reverse causality of product sophistication impacting GVC integration as well. And then you also have other endogenous variables, such as R&D intensity in the model. So the main estimation strategy that I've used is two-step system GMM, which runs the econometric model in the levels equation as well as the first difference equation. And then it uses the lagged values of levels as instruments for first differences and lagged values of first differences as levels for as instruments for the levels equation. And most importantly, this system GMM has been found to outperform IV and fixed effects estimators, particularly when we examine product sophistication in dynamic panel data settings. And so in the study, we used two-step system GMM with robust standard errors clustered at the firm level. And we also conduct a range of robustness checks and sensitivity analysis, and also use the standard sort of diagnostic tests of Hansen's test as well as Arellano and Mons test to ensure that the results are valid and the instruments as a set are exogenous. So I won't go into this in too much detail, and we can come back to this later, but just to give an indication that the firm level product sophistication index essentially is captured using Hausman's product sophistication index. So first I calculate product sophistication for each 4-digit product using the data from World Bank and WITS, UN Comtrade. So this uses the export data and the GDP per capita data for over 113 countries to calculate the product sophistication of each 4-digit product. And then that product is matched to products in prowess. And then I calculate a sales weighted average for each firm to understand the average product sophistication of that firm. So in a sense, we're capturing the income per capita associated with each product. And it's important to highlight here that this product sophistication is capturing actually very big shifts in products. So it's something like going from non-electrical machinery to electrical machinery, bicycles to motorcycles to passenger cars, and manufacture of knitted and crocheted fabrics to wearing apparel. So we're capturing significant shifts in product lines. In terms of GVC integration, GVC firms are identified as those firms that are simultaneously importing intermediate goods and exporting to capture the sort of sequential nature of integration in these value chains. And this also follows pretty much what has been standard in the literature. And then for the sample of these GVC firms, I also calculate the actual magnitude of linkage, which is using a vertical specialization measure that captures the imported intermediates embodied in exports at the firm level. And here imported intermediates include raw materials, stores and spares, capital goods, and services. And so this measure is calculated for the subsample of GVC firms. So as a first look on the summary statistics, we have that around 33% of 16% firms are only importing, 11% are only exporting, so they are one-way traders, and 40% of the sample are domestic firms. So they are engaged with little or no international activities. And just a couple of things to also point out in the summary statistics is that we can see that the R&D intensity levels on an average are very low in the case of the panel. So it goes as high as 96%, but on average, the R&D or innovative capabilities are very low in Indian manufacturing firms. Around 51% of the firms are identified as multi-product firms. So they're producing more than one good. And on an average, this product sophistication index has been normalized in ranges from 0 to 100, with 27 as the average index. And again, if you just look very, at the outset to the descriptive statistics, we can see that product sophistication is associated with type of trading activity. So the average product sophistication level in the case of GVC firms is the highest in the panel, followed by firms that are only importing, then only exporting, and then domestic firms. And even when we look at the distribution of highly sophisticated producers, we find that 45% of them are actually classified as GVC firms. Then I've just presented here again to kind of identify product sophistication trends across industries that further validate the index. So again, as a standard in the literature, you see that product sophistication is higher for pharmaceuticals, machinery, computers, motor vehicles, and transport equipment, and lowest for sort of food products, textiles, leather, wearing apparels. And consistently over time, we see that GVC firms have a higher product sophistication index than non-GVC firms, although the two series seem to follow a very similar time trend in terms of the panel. And finally, coming down to the empirical results of the econometric model. So first, I've just presented here the results of actually linking into GVC. So the impact of GVC status, which is here, on product sophistication index. And so firstly, all the p values for the AR2 test statistic as well as the Hansen test statistic are above 0.05, which confirm that these regressions are valid. And the coefficient on the lag product sophistication is also positive and significant, further confirming the validity of using this method as a way of estimating the impact. Then when we look at the GVC firm dummy here, it's quite clear that there is a positive and significant impact of linking into global value chains for Indian firms on their product sophistication. And on an average, we find that GVC firms produce 2% more sophisticated products than non-GVC firms. And if you look at other variables as well, we find a positive and significant impact of the Herfindahl index. So as the concentration of the industry to which a firm belongs increases, its product sophistication also increases. So so firms in more concentrated industries are generating more profits, perhaps, which are then being reinvested into more sophisticated product lines. And so here R&D intensity also has a positive and significant impact on product sophistication, highlighting the importance of internal efforts of the firms as well to innovate. Interestingly, age has a negative impact. So we find that younger firms are the ones that are producing more sophisticated goods than older firms. And I've carried out a range of robustness checks in the paper using one-step system GMM, including interaction terms between foreign ownership and GVC firm dummy, alternate measurements of labor productivity, as well as the product sophistication index, changing the lag specifications for endogenous variables, conducting checks for using a balance panel to make sure that there is no sort of survival bias or attrition bias in the results, because GVC firms could be the ones that are surviving more in this unbalanced panel. As well as checking the validity of the product sophistication index using different indices. And across all the results, it's quite clear that the GVC firm dummy is positive and significant for all of these robustness checks. And here I'm also concerned about the fact that we could have that more sophisticated firms are self-selecting into GVCs, and therefore I've also carried out another robustness check using propensity score matching and fixed effects to account for any sort of self-selection bias. And here again, you find that the GVC firm dummy, the coefficient on this is positive and significant across both the unbalanced panel and balanced panel. The Herfindahl index as well has a positive sign. So this is just sort of reiterating the point across different econometric problems. And even for the sample of GVC firms, so now if I have a subsample of the GVC firms, even for them, it is quite clear that increasing participation or increasing magnitude of linking into value chains also has a positive and significant impact on product sophistication. So here, GVC embeddedness, which is measured using vertical specialization, we find that across all model specifications, it has a positive impact on product sophistication. Similarly, RMD intensity and Herfindahl index have a positive impact. Interestingly, we find no evidence of foreign ownership or FDI having any sort of impact on product sophistication across both sets of results. So clearly, FDI so far has not had a positive impact on product upgrading of Indian manufacturing firms. And so just before I conclude, I would like to just highlight some caveats of the analysis as well. So first is that Prowess doesn't report data on product level data on what is being exported. It just gives you product level data on overall sales of the firm. So I cannot distinguish between what is being exported versus domestically sold. So that's one disadvantage. The second disadvantage is that we don't have information on the export destinations. So we cannot further unpack the heterogeneity of product sophistication gains from linking across south-south chains or north-south chains. And third, information on buyer-related aspects is not present on Prowess. So we don't know, for instance, what is the impact or how the impact differs across governance in value chains, which is, of course, another very important part of the literature. And just final slide is just summarizing the key findings from the work, that we know that India's GVC linkages are low, but they're shifting towards southern partners. It's important to design trade and trade facilitation policies to facilitate GVC integration to enable product upgrading, because we find that linking into GVCs can boost product sophistication by 2%. The magnitude of participation also matters. We found that increasing GVC embeddedness significantly boosts product sophistication, but we also need complementary investments and policies to boost the internal technological capabilities of the firms, particularly the GVC firms. So we found a positive impact of R&D intensity and royalty intensity for these firms. And lastly, very similar to other studies, we found a negative impact of age, no impact of foreign shares, and a positive impact of the Herfindahl index. So with that, I'll just like to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this nice presentation, Karishma. That's very interesting. So we have a lot of time for questions or like time for a break before the concluding remarks. So please post your questions in the chat. There's one first question which asks whether there was a decline in products of sophistication after the financial crisis.
Yeah, you can see from the chart that I was presenting that just right after the financial crisis, there was a product sophistication decline in both, so in the overall panel, as well as if you look at the GVC firms and non-GVC firms separately, you can see that there was a decline in both. And so the series follows a similar trend. In India, there was a sort of economic boom between 2003, 4, and 5. So you can see product sophistication rising in that case, dropping after the decline, and then somewhat a recovery post, I think, 2010. It has been slightly on the increasing trend.
Okay, great. Thank you.
But why? Then my question was, why does it increase? Since it tells us something about, sorry, I'm coming out of the back and using the capacity that I have. It's Jan Lai speaking. No, my question was why, since it tells us something about how what that indicator tells us. Right? So I'd like to understand why a recession or would then decrease the product sophistication. And then it's also a bit easier to grasp what that indicator really captures. So it's not so obvious that this needs to happen. You can also imagine a story that has precisely the opposite effect.
So I think the indicator captures essentially the income that is associated with the product. So if I'm a firm and I'm exporting products that are usually exported by developed countries, I will be more sophisticated, or I will show up as more sophisticated on that index. But if I'm a producer that is producing, let's say, goods that are usually produced by developing countries or low or middle income countries, such as, let's say, leather or textiles or footwear, then I would be sort of graded low on that product sophistication index. So I think it would have been interesting if we could have actually unpacked the product sophistication according to the destinations. So I think one of the reasons perhaps could be that there was a shift in terms of where these Indian firms are supplying to during the financial crisis, and so which markets were effectively hit by the financial crisis and where the sort of demand was coming from at that point. So I think that could have potentially unpacked why the product sophistication has declined for both GVC and non-GVC firms right after the financial crisis, but increased during the boom. So I think that could have been one factor driving it. But unfortunately, the data destination-wise information is not available. But I think that's a good question to I think about further.
Great, thanks. There's another question raised in the chat on whether you have information on the import side of the firms. So do you know basically, or can you calculate sophistication of imports of the firms?
So the product sophistication is calculating, so I didn't get the question. So if I do have information on the imports of the firm. So we have information in prowess on, let's say, the import of how much of capital goods have been imported, or raw materials or services have been imported. But particularly the technological content of those imports, we don't have information on. But there is a lot of other information in terms of, so for instance, you can find out one of the variables I've looked at is royalty, which looks at sort of the foreign technical know-how that you're importing, or license fees. So those variables are included in the regressions as controls to understand kind of how much of this learning by import is happening. So so royalty, I think, controls for that. But I don't have information particularly on the exact content of technological content import-wise for each firm in prowess.
Jan, do you have a question? Because I see you.
Yes, I can add. I think what it's Bart Loos who's asking that to the previous question. What he means is that very similar to your export sophistication index, you could construct a similar index on the import side of the firm. Say, as you use sales for the exports, you could also use the input value of the different products on the import side, and thereby get to an index of say import sophistication at the firm level, and whether that is an avenue that you have pursued, right? So in that sense, you can say something on the technological, as you call it, content on the import side.
Okay, yeah, yes, thanks for the clarification. I think that's very useful. So just to give you a bit of context, why sort of product sophistication is constructed the way it is, and why the focus on sort of this sales sophistication or export sophistication. I was generally interested in looking at how the upgrading opportunities of developing countries are being shaped in global value chains. And usually under economic upgrading, you have these sort of categories coming up where you have productivity as one of the indicators, product upgrading is the other one, functional upgrading is a third one. So in the sort of series of paper I'm doing, I'm trying to unpack the impact of linking into value chains on productivity in a separate paper, and this one focuses on product upgrading. So you're right in the sense that, of course, yeah, we can calculate in a very similar way then the import sophistication, but perhaps, so I think that that's a bit beyond the scope of the paper, but yes, that can be done in a similar way to the Hausman product sophistication index. So yeah, that's a very useful clarification. Thank you.
Okay, maybe one last question from my side regarding the identification. Basically, remind me please about the time period covered. Do you start like basically with the beginning of the PROES data in the 80s? So is there any chance that you could use trade liberalization as a shock, because that's already well established in the literature as being exogenous? So maybe you could observe like increase in GVC participation as a result of the liberalization to get some exogenous variation in there.
Yeah, I mean, the data set available from PROES, goes back, I think, to 1970s or 80s, I think 1980s. But there is a lot of, so these firms were not, initially asked to report. So there was no certain requirement on them to import. So the data is a bit patchy first. And second, the reason why 2001 sort of has been chosen as the cutoff or the starting point for analysis is because it was in 2000 that the firms were required to report information on foreign direct investment. So we only have information about whether or not a firm is a foreign firm and the actual magnitude of the foreign shares from 2001. So that, I think, is one of the big reasons why I've restricted, particularly in a GVC sort of context, I've restricted the analysis, interestingly looking at just that aspect of the last sort of what is happening in the last 15, 20 years. But yes, yeah, there is information definitely available previously as well to account for the liberalization, the big liberalization that took place. But perhaps in a different...
Okay, perfect, thank you. As I don't see any more questions, I think we have a 15 minutes break before we continue with the closing remark, which will be also in this room. So you can just stay if you want, but I would close this session for now. Thank you so much for the presentations and the active participation. And then, yeah, see you for the last session of today in about 15 minutes.
Thank you, and thanks everyone for the questions. Thank you.